All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we are digging into the latest clinical review from the Canadian Pharmacists Association all about non-hormonal contraception. We're going to pull out the key takeaways you can use in your practice right away.
Okay, let's just jump right in with a really important number. In Canada, it's estimated that nearly half of all pregnancies are unintended. And that one number, right there, really sets the stage for why this conversation is so incredibly important.
And this quote, wow, it really gets to the heart of what patients are experiencing. It just shows this huge knowledge gap. And that's where you, as a pharmacist, come in. You're not just dispensing, you're a crucial educator who can really shine a light on all the options out there.
So here's how we're going to break it down today. First, we'll look at the contraception gap in Canada. Then, we'll get into the biology of the fertile window. After that, we'll dive into fertility awareness-based methods, then barrier methods, and we'll wrap it all up with how to counsel patients on all these non-hormonal options.
All right, first up, let's really set the scene and understand the landscape your patients are trying to navigate.
So when you look at these numbers from the Canadian Community Health Survey, the picture becomes really clear. You know, among young adults, more than 20% used nothing last time. And the cost of unintended pregnancies? Over $320 million a year. This isn't just a small issue. It really highlights the urgent need for good, proactive counseling in our communities.
Okay, so now let's pivot to the science behind all this. This is the foundation for pretty much all non-hormonal approaches, especially the fertility awareness ones.
Okay, so you've got your two main phases of the reproductive cycle, right? The follicular and the luteal. Now, here's the key thing to remember for counseling. That luteal phase is pretty consistent, usually about 14 days. But the follicular phase, that can vary a lot. And that's what makes it so darn tricky to pinpoint ovulation.
So this right here, this is our target. We're talking about the fertile window. See, sperm can hang around for up to 5 days, and an ovum is viable for about 1 day. That gives you this specific 6-day window where conception is possible. The whole goal of fertility awareness is just to figure out when that window is and plan accordingly.
So that leads us right into a whole category of methods that honestly require a lot from the patient. We're talking about fertility awareness-based methods, or FABMs.
The whole idea behind any FABM is that the patient is in charge of monitoring their own body. They're the ones tracking their temperature, checking cervical mucus, or marking calendar days. All that responsibility to collect and interpret the data, it falls right on their shoulders.
And this is where things get really interesting. Just look at the difference between perfect use and typical use. It is huge. I mean, for the symptothermal method, you go from a 0.3% failure rate to potentially 20% in the real world. That gap is probably one of the most important things to talk about with any patient thinking about these methods.
So when you're counseling a patient on FABMs, you really have to frame it as a major lifestyle commitment. You got to stress the need for constant, careful tracking, the fact that it really only works for people with super regular cycles, and that simple things like getting sick, being stressed, or even traveling can throw the whole system off. And of course the big one, zero, and I mean zero protection from STIs.
Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about barrier methods. These take a much more direct approach. They physically block sperm from getting into the uterus.
And here we go again with that gap between correct and typical use. That 18% typical failure rate for external condoms, that's not usually the product failing. It's user error. And that's why our job isn't just recommending a product. It's teaching people how to use it right.
So for external condoms, probably the most common barrier method you'll talk about, your counseling needs to be super practical. We're talking about picking the right material for STI protection and then hitting all those common mistakes, using the wrong lubricant, storing them in a hot car, or just not putting them on correctly.
This little table is a fantastic tool to have in your back pocket. The whole lubricant question comes up all the time, and getting it right is crucial. But the most important thing to point out here? Lambskin condoms. Yeah, they can prevent pregnancy, but they do not protect against STIs. That's a critical distinction.
And we need to be just as clear about the other options on the table. Internal condoms, they're a great alternative, and they also give you that STI protection. But spermicides used by themselves? Whoa. The typical failure rate is really high. And, this is super important, frequent use can actually irritate the mucosa and might even increase the risk of getting HIV.
All right, let's pull all of this together. What are the big clinical takeaways for you when you're counseling a patient?
This chart really says it all, doesn't it? This is the reality for the average person using these methods. We're not in a lab here. This is real life. And seeing those high typical failure rates right there, that's such a critical part of making a shared decision with a patient.
And if there's one thing to drive home, it's this. This is probably the single most important distinction in all of contraception counseling: STI protection. You have to talk about dual protection, and you have to be crystal clear that only condoms, external and internal, can do that job.
So at the end of the day, that leaves us with this question. We see this huge gap between perfect and typical use. So how can we, as pharmacists, best empower our patients to not just choose the right method, but to actually use it correctly? Because our role isn't just to give them a list of options, it's about bridging that gap with clear, effective counseling so they can actually be successful.